welcome to today's session where we'll be diving into the technical aspects of building horizon walls on web and mobile platforms. It's so good to see you all again. And as most of you already know, I am Chimde, and I support our creator engagements within the Meta Horizon Creator Program. My team's ultimate goal is to continue to support you all to build amazing, high-quality experiences on Meta Horizon. I'll be emceeing today's session, and I would like my colleague and today's subject matter expert to introduce himself as well.
Hey everyone, I'm Andy Sargeant. I am a game developer and community manager. It's great to be back. Thank you for having me again. I'm looking forward to diving deep on Meta Horizon Worlds on web and mobile.
Thank you, Andy, for that introduction. For today's run of show, I'll walk you through some housekeeping rules and goals for today's session. And then I'll hand over to Andy for the deep dive, and then I'll wrap it up with a Q&A. Our goal with today's session will be to showcase and walk you through the release tools for making your walls accessible on web and mobile. We'll also explore some mechanics that are possible on mobile and suggest ways you can incorporate them in your existing workflow. And as it relates to monetization, it won't be our focus for today's session. This will solely be a technical update. We had your feedback in the last session about IWP's availability on mobile. We had you loud and clear. We work with various internal stakeholders and product leaders to ensure we act on the feedback that you all share with us. We shared your feedback about monetization, and we are happy to share that they have listened and are actively working on accelerating IWP's availability on mobile. Please, we encourage you to continue to share feedback with our team whenever you have pain points or frustrations through the appropriate channels, and we'll continue to get them in front of the relevant teams, and we'll ensure to come back with you with updates as we have them. Our hope today is that this deep dive session that helps you better understand what's feasible with the opportunities, and hopefully inspire some interesting ways they can approach building for web and for mobile. At this juncture, I will now pass the mic to Andy to take us through this technical deep dive. Over to you, Andy. Take it from here.
Thanks, Chimdi. Thanks for the introduction. Hello again. I'm really excited to get a bit more technical today to show some of the ways that we can create and adapt worlds that work on web and mobile using the tools that you all had access to or received access to on the 14th of March. This is going to be a bit more of a relaxed session. It's a little bit longer in terms of how long I'm talking for. So it would be really nice to have some two-way communication. So if you feel like it, I'd love you to put in the comments what worlds you're currently thinking about converting to web and mobile. Maybe worlds that you're thinking about, new worlds that you might be thinking about, or worlds that you already have in your repertoire that you're thinking, oh, this would be cool if I adapt this one. And I'll take a pause when we start looking at the TypeScript APIs later on and go through some, and maybe we can jam some ideas around how we might be able to do some of that and open that up for a bit of discussion. So yeah, feel free to put that stuff in the comments and I'll call stuff out when I see it. But for now, I'll introduce today's topic. Yeah, so last time I was here, we talked a little bit about what Horizon Worlds coming to web and mobile means for you as creators. So in our previous session, we talked about how it means that by publishing your world on web and mobile, you'll be able to reach your community. You'll be able to extend your reach so that the people that love your world and love the community that you're growing in there, they can not miss out. They can jump in on their mobile, whether they're away from their headset or in a different room or whatever's going on. They might be multi-screening using their laptop and watching telly at the same time or whatever it is. So it just means that you can extend your reach and reach out to your community even when they're not in their headset. It also offers us as creators a new creative landscape. And what I mean by that is like this new frontier where we've got people from all different devices interacting with each other. And that's really exciting. And there's loads of opportunities to explore game design and world design and how those people interact with each other and how your community can grow across all the different devices. I spoke a little bit about the shiny new tools that you now have access to. So that was really an overview. Today, we're going to be diving a little bit deeper into those tools thinking about how we can use them, and I'll hopefully be answering any questions you have around those tools. I also shared the resources and the support that we have available to get started, and instructions on, some light instructions on how you can go about submitting your worlds. And I'll give you a bit more information around that towards the end of this talk. And we also talked about what it meant for your visitors and your community. So this is like a real value add for them, because they can essentially jump into Horizon Worlds, whether they're near their headset or not, and it's a much lower friction. So, if your world's available on mobile, it might be that they don't want to be in VR or right now, or their headset's on charge or whatever it is, or they don't want to put it on their head. They've done their hair for their night out or something. I don't know. And so it just has that reduced friction to join your worlds and meet their friends. And they can jump in when they're not near their headset. And also people who constantly hear their friends talk about how awesome your world is in Horizon Worlds, they can now be a part of this too, even if they don't have a headset. So they can kind of jump in with on their desktop or on their mobile device, and they could join their friends and not miss out on your awesome worlds and your awesome games. And so from these, we're kind of hoping, from our perspective, we're kind of hoping to see more regular visits from the audience. So like your community, you should be seeing like them jump in more regularly. You should be able to see them have more social time with their friends and their colleagues and all that in your worlds. And field servers, and by that I mean, when I say everyone wins, I mean visitors win, because it's more fun to play around in Horizon Worlds with other people, and you as creators win because you get to see all these awesome, friendly, happy people in your worlds enjoying what you've made, and everything that goes with that. So that's what the visitors get from this boost as well. So on to the tools that we're talking about today. So here's a list of the tools that you were given access to. And so we're going to be diving into each one individually and exploring how to use them. One of the key challenges for us as creators is the sort of disparity between being in VR and having this really high fidelity interaction, this environment that we can move around and feel with our controllers, and that's completely immersive, versus on mobile. There's a lot more simplified controls that mobile and desktop users have, and also that they're familiar with, that they want to be able to use. So there's like a bunch of conventions around mobile games and mobile worlds, and the same on desktop, that essentially these tools are bridging that gap between the high fidelity interaction, immersive Horizon Worlds that we have in VR, bridging that with the screens-based devices that make it more approachable for lots and lots of people. Okay, so alongside this talk, I just wanted to call out that there is documentation available on the Zendesk for all of these tools, and for the TypeScript APIs as well. So if anything goes unanswered here, there is also an example world that you have access to. So if you go to create a new world in your VR headset, where you have all the templates for making a new world, you should be able to find that there's a web and mobile examples world. And in there, it's got all of the things that I'm talking about today. And you can start from there as your boilerplate, and you'll have access to all of the TypeScript source code. And essentially, you can use that as your starting point to create stuff for web and mobile. So when I'm building prototypes, I like to have a VS Code window open with the source code for that world in it, just so that I can quickly reference how we've done things in the past and how those examples work, even if I'm working in a completely different world. Okay, so push button interactions. I'm starting with this one because it's the tool that's like most likely to be relevant to everyone. At the moment in VR, you tend to make a button by placing a trigger on top of a button, and then a player will put their hand in the button or on the button and press it. There's lots of different ways of making buttons, but that's a really common pattern that we see across Horizon Worlds. And so this push button interactions is a simple way of enabling that. So in the demonstration video, you can see I've got this mouse, and on top of the mouse is a trigger, and it's really, really tiny, and it's hard to actually reach and touch on desktop and mobile. But by selecting the selectable on screens, when the trigger is enabled, I can now interact with it, just like I would in like a native app or game. And so on web, essentially that will mean that the player can look at it and press E on their keyboard to interact. But on mobile, it means they can actually touch that button. And this is a really fun thing to explore for adding those interactions to web and mobile. It doesn't have to be a button. You can make anything in your world selectable on screens by adding a trigger and then making it selectable on screens. So we can kind of carve out volumes in our invisible volumes in our world that are selectable on screens. One tip I would give is not to have loads and loads and loads of these all in one sort of frame, because it can be quite challenging for someone to be able to choose which thing to select. But yeah, this is a really useful tool for adding functionality. When a player interacts with the trigger, it essentially calls the on player entered the trigger code block. So that's essentially what you won't necessarily need to write any new code. You just need to check that toggle. When they release, do we get on trigger exit? No, we don't get on trigger exit when they release. It's literally because it will probably be a tap on mobile or pressing E or on web. But good question. Thanks for that. You can also play with this in terms of like offering distinct functionality for different devices. So it might be that you use that trigger volume to open a door or something like that. So you can play around with this idea. And I'll talk a little bit more about diversifying functionality and asymmetrical gameplay when we look at the TypeScript APIs. Okay, onto grabbable entities. So there's a bunch of work that's gone into making grabbables work correctly on web and mobile, especially weapons. I think the first title to come out on web and mobile was Super Rumble. And so from that stemmed a lot of the functionality that you're seeing. So here I've got a grabbable entity. So it's set to be interactive and grabbable. And at the moment, it just works. So I can tap on that entity on mobile, or I can look at it and press E on web, and it will appear on my arm using the same grab anchor that it does in VR. But what's really cool is you can actually set the pose of the avatar when they're holding it. So the pose of the avatar is dependent on what they're holding. So you set it all up on the entity itself. So for example, this launcher, I've now set it to be held in a pistol pose, which means that the avatar now holds it up like a pistol rather than just running around with a tube on their arm. They're actually holding it how it should be. The animation, the poses that we have so far, tend to be all weapon focused, but this is an area where we would love to hear any suggestions or comments from you regarding other poses that we might want to add. The more generic, the better. So rather than thinking I need a pose for holding a teapot, maybe a pose for holding something with a handle like this, and that could then be applied to lots and lots of different use cases. So the more generic, the better, but we'd love to hear more poses or ideas for poses that we can add to the roster, because your worlds have lots of diverse and interesting and funky kind of mechanics that aren't just combat focused. So yeah, really up for hearing about that. When a player is holding a grabbable entity and you can set the pose, those poses also come with 2 animations, which I'll talk about when we look at the TypeScript APIs. But you saw the player shooting like this. That's all available to you as well. Yeah, weapon swipe like a sword. There is actually a sword pose, and essentially when you run the fire animation, it strikes a sword pose. It does a weapon swipe, so that's already available. Okay, this is a small tool, I guess you could say, but it's still really relevant and kind of important. And this is the crosshair. So the grabbable, you can set a specific crosshair for that grabbable entity. There's 3 to choose from. You can have a cross, a dot, or a circle. This is actually more important than it sounds, because you're communicating to the player what that thing they're holding is, and that's really important when you're just you have a space between you and the player rather than in VR where you are the player. So the cross is kind of telling the player, hey, this is probably a weapon. The dot is telling them this might be like a futuristic weapon, like a laser pointer, or it could be used as more like a laser pointer or a chalk pen or something like that. And then the circle is really communicating this is a weapon, but it's likely to not be very accurate. So it'll be shooting in this general area. So worth thinking about what crosshair you want to use. You can also set none if it's not applicable to your world. Okay, grabbables. Oh, aiming. So when an avatar is holding something in their hands, this is specific to combat and guns. So let's talk about it in that context. When they're holding it, the actual direction of any child projectile launcher on that entity, it's basically influenced by the avatar's animation. So whatever direction their hands moving in and that kind of thing. So to avoid that, avoiding like the inaccuracy that would give players, you can actually set the grab aim rotation and grab aim position, and that will then change what that projectile launcher is doing. So whether it will change what position it's in and what rotation it's in. So you can completely customize that projectile launcher through using the grab aim rotation and position, so that it's more accurate. And this is only affecting players on web and mobile. So it's pretty important to make sure that it meets their expectations and shoots in the direction it's going to. In the video, you can see that I've essentially set that up. So now the launcher that I've got there is able to shoot in the correct direction. Cool. Also on the grabbable entities is the context sensitive buttons. So on mobile, this is especially important, but it does show up on desktop as well. The button icons, you can customize those depending on what the grabbable entity is. And they're in the properties, just like the other ones that you've just seen. In the properties, you'll see that there's a primary button, a secondary button, and a tertiary button. So you can set specific icons to be on those buttons, and they map directly to code block events for index trigger press. Pressing Y on the controller is the same as secondary, and there's a tertiary button as well. And essentially, like if you're sticking to the sort of conventions that things like games like Super Rumble have, you've got that primary button, which is the trigger, which is shoot. So you would set that to shoot, and then the secondary one is a smaller icon, so that might be reload or something like that. It's vital that actions in your world are represented appropriately so that mobile players don't get lost or stuck or miss out on the fun and they don't know what's going on. So those icons really communicate what a grabbable entity can do, what actions are available with it. So it's important to set those for that reason, but it's also important to set them for the fact that by default, all three of those buttons will appear. If your grabbable entity doesn't necessarily use any of those actions, you should go in and set them to none so that the buttons don't appear. Otherwise, mobile players will be tapping the screen thinking something's going to happen and it doesn't. So yeah, make sure to turn them off for grabbable entities that don't need those. And so these are a bunch of the icons. You can see that there's, again, like quite combat focused. But this is another thing, another area we'd love to hear any feedback or suggestions for icons, additional icons that would be worth including. Again, the more generic, the better, the more likely they'll be used across different worlds. And we'll listen to that feedback intently and hopefully be able to, supply icons that are appropriate for your worlds and your games. So those are the desktop tools that have been rolled out. Hopefully let us know how you get on with them. We're always interested in listening to feedback. Okay, so before we dig into the TypeScript stuff or the scripting APIs, I wanted to make a couple of things clear. So everything in this section with the scripting APIs is pretty much TypeScript only. So you can invoke TypeScript using code blocks. So that means if you aren't using TypeScript, you can still use some of the template content, but you'll need to call that from your code block events. And I would say, like, whilst coding in TypeScript is different from coding in code blocks, I mean, you have to handwrite code and that kind of thing. The hard part to learning, I think the really hard part to learning coding is the logical flow and thinking like a computer. And so code blocks is actually a really nice stepping stone into like already learning that logical flow. There's some great sessions coming up that can help you to convert code that you already have in code blocks into TypeScript. And this will mean then you can dive into using the web and mobile APIs. Maybe the web and mobile APIs could be like a kind of this is a kind of a good reason to start investigating TypeScript. You haven't necessarily needed to yet, but maybe if you're thinking about this stuff, it's a good opportunity to look into it. I'd also say that reach out to the community for support in leveling up with TypeScript. And don't forget that there's loads of TypeScript documentation on Zendesk. So as I've said, all the coding APIs for web and mobile use TypeScript. Another important point that I need to bring up is that many of these APIs, because they're specific for the players on those devices, they need to run on a script which is attached to an object that's owned by the player. Need to run on a local script that's attached to an object that's owned by the player. So I'm going to give a quick run through. Hopefully this is helpful of like how all of that kind of works and the architecture. For some people here, this might be something they're already very happy with and fully understand. I think it's always helpful to revisit fundamentals. For some people, it might be like completely new concepts or challenging new ideas that they haven't really considered before. So just bear with me while I go through this stuff just to make sure that we're all on the same level when I start talking about local scripts in a second. When a player travels to a world, they're essentially asking Horizon Worlds, hey, I want to go to this world. And if no one else is there, then Horizon Worlds will start up a server. And the server's job is there to essentially host the world. When the player arrives, they technically become a client. So they're the client, and then there's the server, which is hosting the world. A client is just another name for the player's device. So a client could be like a Quest 3 or an iPhone or whatever. And the server and the client talk to each other constantly. The client will be saying things like, oh, they moved the thumbstick, so they want to go over there. And then the server will be listening to that and saying things like, oh, Andy's traveling over there. Hey, everyone else connected. Andy's moving over there. And this means that we can see each other run around and walk around in the world. We can throw basketballs and we can chat to each other. And that's how that all works, is through that server-client relationship. And you can choose for your script to run on the server, which is what it does by default, or you can choose it to run on the client. If you go into the script properties, either through the desktop editor in the script menu, or click on the script and go into the properties, you can actually choose the script execution mode to be local in that dropdown. And that means that whatever functionality the script is executing, they're executing for the person who owns that object that the script is attached to. And sometimes that could communicate stuff back up to the server, depending on if it needs to, like the player played a firing animation, so communicate that to the server and everyone else will see them have play the firing animation. But not necessarily always. You wouldn't want to necessarily do that with the camera API, for example. And so this is like really important part for web and mobile. A core example here would be the camera API for all the players in the world. You wouldn't really want to be adjusting the camera for the players in VR. I don't think that would be very enjoyable. So the camera API is a great example of where we need that script to be running locally and not for everyone. So how do we build that? Essentially, we have an empty object that has the player camera API script or whatever you're doing with the API attached to it. And that script is running in local mode. And we have like a manager script that sits on the server and that listens out for any on-player enter world events. And then it makes those objects owned by the players. So think of it like the manager script on the server is handing out wristbands at an event. Someone arrives at the event and the manager script goes, oh, welcome. Here's your camera API script, and here's your custom input script, and here's all these other scripts that you're going to need. And then that's then owned by the player, and they can walk around and they have those on them. And then when the manager gets the on-player exit world event, i.e. someone leaves the world, they then take back that wristband, or they take back the camera API script or the player custom input script or whatever it is. And then they make that owned by the server player. So it's still a locally run script, except it's now being owned by the server player. So essentially only on the server. This means that when the next person jumps in, they have a script that they can give to them. So we essentially have to make a pool of these objects. It's called object pooling. So the manager can sit there and dish out wristbands or dish out these scripts, and it means that they can be recycled. I also wanted to say that if you wanted to communicate between the local script and the server, that's totally doable. You would need to use network events or network broadcast events. A big shout out to Shard here, because this is probably one of the most concise and well put together posts on events that I've seen. It really clearly lays out when you would want to use each one, what's possible to do with each one's, and some of the gotchas as well. I saw this post on the scripting community, and I just wanted to say this is a really cool post and worth checking out. If you get stuck, there is also the, there's that scripting community, and they're all like really helpful and friendly and amazing. But there's also the Zendesk. There's a topic called Getting Started with Local Scripting, which goes through this in a bit more depth, if you're not sure about some of the things that I've talked about today. Okay, so this is something I alluded to earlier, but when a player is holding a grabbable entity, we can essentially play an animation. So here I have the launcher, and at the moment it already is set up to be able to play the firing animation. But I'm just going to run through how to adapt it so that it can play the reloading animation. So I go to the script that it's on. You can see that I've already set the pose, and I'm going to set up the button here. So I'm choosing which button. I want it to be reload on the secondary button. And then in my script, you can see that on index trigger down, that's where I play the fire animation. And so I'm essentially going to use the same sort of code. So I'm going to connect a code block event attached to this entity. And this is on a script that's running locally, by the way. So the script is attached to the entity. It's running locally. When the entity gets picked up by the player, we set it to be owned by the player. And then we say, get hold of the owner and check that it's the player that pressed the button. And if it is, we're going to play avatar grip pose animation by name. And we're going to choose the reload animation. So that one, and then reload. Cool. So then save the script and return to the world. You'll see that it's compiling in the desktop editor. Let's test that out. Oh, Shard says Waffle has a nice flowchart based on those network events. And so I'm shooting the gun, and then when I press the reload button, the reload animation triggers. So it's fairly straightforward. It's kind of one line of code, and you could build like a helper class around this to essentially do all of that for you. But I thought I'd share it in the context of that specific prototype, where it's a target practice world and all that sort of stuff. Okay, this is a brief overview. I'm not going to dive into exactly how to set this up. It's very similar to the way that we set up the camera API and the focused interactions, which I'm about to look at. But I wanted to shout out that there's custom input, which means that you can attach buttons to the mobile screen and to give web players buttons that are not dependent on the grabbable entity. So in Super Rumble, this is the superpower button that's in the middle at the bottom. So these, you can add and remove these during the runtime of your world. So it means that essentially you can have, you can set up your own custom inputs. Custom input also allows you to have access to the left joystick on mobile, or WASD controls on web. So it's really worth exploring this. And these buttons, especially these buttons, it would be interesting to play around with. At the moment, they've just been used in like combat settings and for special moves. I'm super interested in seeing like if anyone wanted to dabble in using them to sort of allow people to show up and express themselves in different way. Like what if you press that button and a dance floor appeared above you, underneath you, wherever you are, or like, fireworks went off on your head, or, and then like, obviously alongside that, there's a bunch of like, you can unlock new things and new expressions that you could build into your game. So custom input is a really interesting area to explore. And I think that there's a lot you can do with having buttons on your screen that surprise and delight your players and your users. You can completely separate functionality for the different devices using the player's device type. So you just get hold of the player's device type and you can check it against whether it's VR, desktop or mobile. And this is a great opportunity to add value depending on what device people are jumping in with. This is like one of the core fundamental building blocks of Kaiju, which is a game. I think it's undergoing another playtest at the moment. Essentially, it's asymmetrical gameplay, which means that if you jump into Kaiju in VR, you can play as the Kaiju, which means you can smash buildings. And we use this specific call to determine whether you get the Kaiju head and whether you can smash buildings. If you're in VR versus when you're on screens, you show up with a jetpack and a laser, and you're tiny and you can attack the Kaiju that way. So this is a really interesting thing to play with. Okay, this is on-screen UI. So I'll explain what's going on in the video. So when I shoot the launcher here, you can see that there's a little pink counter for how much ammo I have in the launcher. And essentially what we can do with on-screen UI is that number is just hovering in the world at the moment. And so we can actually affix it to the screen. So so now it's fixed to the screen. It's backwards, but it's fixed. So we can just turn that around and then and we can actually position it. So here you can see that I'm going into the position of that entity, the text gizmo on the screens, and I'm setting the rotation and the position. And so when I preview again, it's now in the bottom left corner and it's keeping a track of my ammo. Okay, the camera API. This is really fun to play around with. So in this prototype, I've got a spectate mode set up, but I don't want to make players have to stand there with the camera behind them. The camera API allows us to do all sorts of cool stuff. So we can just use it to, change the field of view and the camera roll to give some really interesting effects, which would be especially interesting in like a horror setting, like playing around with distorting reality. But we can also do things like switch between first and third person. So first person camera mode is would be super helpful in small spaces. In this script, I'm showing that the player camera has an owner that's set to the player. So the player camera is an object, and we're setting its owner to this player. And then by doing that, I can actually change what the camera is doing. So when they enter that trigger, I'm saying I've set the variable to say it's in spectate mode. So when the player enters there, we essentially are calling in the player camera script. We're saying set them to a fixed camera that's in somewhere else. And I also set it up so that when they go through the tunnel in the world, it switches to first person mode. And this is really important because when the camera is in third person and you're in small spaces, it can actually be really difficult to navigate. So in this example, so if you're building a world with like lots of tiny corridors or places to hide, then it's worth switching into first person camera mode automatically in those spaces, or at least allowing the player to be able to do that. You can turn on toggling between the camera modes in your world. And here, I've just made a trigger that whenever you're in it, it turns into first person camera mode. So this is a way that we could do something like adding, enabling the user to just be able to see where they're going. If you're finding that your world has got lots of text everywhere and it's difficult to read, especially on a mobile screen, sometimes a quick win will be just to make it so that by default, all the players come in first person camera mode so that they can really easily see the text. They don't have the avatar in the way and it's closer up. Aim assist for mobile players. So we can set the target of the aim assist and the camera will take over from there. The target can be a player or an entity or even like a point in the world. And once we've set the target, we can set properties like how much the aim assist should pull the camera to point at that thing. This is very, very combat focused and needs a little bit of fine tuning, but it means that mobile players stand a chance in a world where you can dual wield and you can look in this direction and shoot in this direction. Focused interactions is the last TypeScript API I'm going to talk about. Unfortunately, I'm running low on time, so I don't get to dive into this one in loads and loads of depth. But this is probably by far one of the most exciting APIs to play around with, because what it enables you to do is interact directly with the screen. You're not forced into those specific buttons and joystick. You can actually touch on the screen. You get a touch started event, a touch moved event, and a touch ended event. So you can do things like manipulate objects in 3D space, and you can fling things around using swipes. And this is what I was talking about with Regal Boxing earlier. It's like you could do something like swiping to punch, or tapping different parts of the screen to be able to do things. What's really cool about this is you essentially can raycast from where the player tapped on the camera all the way through to whatever it hits next. So you can literally allow mobile players to touch the objects that are in your world. And this deserves a lot of exploration and interest. Because it's a really cool thing to do. When you get that event, you get the interaction index. At the moment, it's set to 0. There will be that's just you only get one touch event at the moment. The interaction index is to future-proof it for when multi-touch becomes available. So at the moment, it's one touch. But yeah, in the future, it's just to make sure that there's no need to update this API and change all of your worlds when multi-touch is available. You get the screen position, so that's where they touched on the screen, world ray origin, which is and the world ray direction, which means you can shoot that raycast out. Okay, so those are the TypeScript APIs and the tools. I've put together a couple of slides if you to essentially go through the how to incorporate some of this in your projects. And I know we're at sort of a time when we talked about we would do the Q&A. So I'll gently sort of whistle through these slides because it's worth thinking about how to approach web and mobile from like a more like a step back project management frame of mind. It can be a little bit overwhelming with all these new tools and supporting 3 devices. So I just wanted to offer some suggestions of how to approach this. In the meantime, thanks everyone for sharing worlds that you think would be really cool for other creators to adapt or to change. It'd be really fun to also share what of these tools and APIs that I've discussed today, what's standing out as inspiring or interesting or something that you'd like to take a look at. And that's just so that we can have a little read through, or if there's any more questions at the end. So this is a lot of new tools, and it's easy to get a little bit overwhelmed with all of this stuff. So I would suggest the first thing, or if you're thinking about this, is just to lower the stakes a little bit and not necessarily think about this as like now I need to make all of my worlds playable on web and mobile. So maybe just go back to, the core of what's great about being a creator, and, take a pen and paper, jam some ideas for mechanics, mix and match between VR and web and mobile, and play with the tools and play with the APIs, make some sandboxes, just play around with what's possible, what's easy, what's a little bit more challenging but offers loads of opportunities. And then from there, you can kind of build out this idea of where you would like to take some of these tools and what you'd like to do with them. And if you're looking for inspiration, I would suggest you play lots of mobile games and play some terrible mobile games, because you can learn a lot from terrible mobile games. And play games that have been ported across different devices to see how they show up in the different places and how they meet their audience's needs across the different spaces that they take. And also, how do they keep their essence with completely fresh input and mechanics? So the same world on a different thing, but making it fresh. How does that work? In terms of the design phase, you might be thinking, I've got a design for three devices all at once. So you can certainly not worry about that. If you feel like that's a bit overwhelming, then maybe take one device first. You can get the world working quicker. You can prove out that mechanic. And if you're working on a tight timeline, that would be a better option. Alternatively, and slightly more preferably, would be to consider all of the platforms from the beginning and think about how the same world will be enjoyable across all of those different things. That's a lot more time consuming, especially from the design phase and even into implementation and testing. but it means that when it launches, it'll be the best experience for all the players from day one, rather than making something for one platform and then trying to squeeze in some additional mechanics to give that extra value for the other platforms. So both devices first is kind of preferable over one device first. And then if we are starting with one device, which might be the option you go for, maybe thinking about which to design for first, mobile first or VR first. And that's completely up to you, and something you might choose to do in whatever your creative practice looks like. But one thing to consider, like a way of thinking about this might be, if you go with mobile first, you've got the tighter constraints, so you're forced to look at this screen and make something fun on a tiny space, so that when you come to make that for VR, you're actually in that world and it's already going to be really exhilarating and interesting and exciting. Versus starting in VR, where you can make something really magical and amazing, but then when you come to port it to mobile, it's a little bit harder to get that to get that, because you have to kind of remove that immersion and maybe remove some mechanics or skip them or whatever that looks like. So worth considering mobile. If you're thinking about building a world for web and mobile and VR, maybe start with mobile first if you're going to start with one device, or start with all three and try and figure out in design phase, before you start implementing anything, how it's going to show up in the different ones, just so that you've got in the back of your head, I could think about it like this, and that'll work nicely in mobile. And here's this is essentially our implementation when we're on VR. It's pretty straightforward. This is what I was talking about with the added complexity. When you design a feature that works across the different devices, each of those devices need its own version of these things. So worth thinking about this when you're thinking about timelines and how much time you want to invest. Essentially, what I mean by this is focusing on giving the players. Essentially, I just wanted to call out here that as a creator, it's up to you how to approach this and how you want to approach making things that are accessible across devices. My suggestion would be to kind of aim for quality of experience that's the same, rather than trying to emulate the same interactions on each one. Cool. And then finally, how to test on your devices. So you can actually test any of your worlds on mobile. You just go to horizon.meta.com, go to the creator tools, all on your mobile. You'll need to add it as to your homepage as an app. And then when it opens up, you can see you can then access your creator tools, and here's all the games that I'm working on or have been involved in or I'm collaborating on. And then you click the open world details page, which will take you to the details page for that world. And then you can just click preview, and that's available for you already. And you don't even need to publish your world. You should be able to just click preview and it take you there. So that's how to do it on mobile. On desktop, it's a lot easier. You just go in the browser, go to horizon.meta.com, creator tools, and then find your world in that list. And publishing. So starting Tuesday, the 2nd of April, you'll be able to publish your world on web and mobile. The way we do that is you essentially submit your world to a Discord channel called Screens World Submissions. We'll ask you to make a post following a kind of template, just like we do bug reporting at the moment, which will have your world information and your cover art images and all that kind of stuff. Because when your world's available on web and mobile, it will be the cover art is in different sizes, and sometimes it has overlays of depending on what device people are looking at it. So you get to supply completely new cover art for it in 4 different sizes. But we'll share more about the details of that submission process when the submission process goes live on the 2nd of April. And really looking forward to opening that and to seeing how you've approached or what you've got, what you've been working on for web and mobile. Cool. Thanks very much, everyone. Hopefully there's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, especially squashed at the end, but hopefully that was interesting and useful. I know that one of the questions I regularly get when I talk is, have you got any resources that we can look at? So I actually have a few different resources that I can share, that I'll ask the team to share with you after this talk, all ready to go. So yeah, that's on its way. But yeah, back to you, Chimdi. I think we're opening up for questions now, right?
That's correct. What a fantastic session, Andy. Thank you for doing justice to this technical deep dive. I'm sure the creators appreciated it. We'll go into Q&As now, and we have been tracking the questions that you've sent in, and we'll try as much as possible to get through most of them. So we'll start. Is there a way to control the third-person web camera via script to improve the overall web experience?
Using the camera API, you can control the camera completely. You can detach it from the avatar, you can make it first person, you can spin it around, you can kind of do whatever you want. There's lots of opportunities that presents, because it means that you can like have a spectate mode where you're not behind your camera. Opens it up to maybe someone streaming, or you could host an event and see everyone on the screen at once. So it's actually like a really exciting addition. Yeah.
About the crosshair that you talked about, is there a way for creators to import a texture?
Not at the moment. No, there's no way to do that. There's 3 crosshairs to select from or off.
You also mentioned that it would be difficult to have a bunch of triggers next to each other in a world. Do you have any suggestions around spacing or tips to make this function better, to make the mobile experience just as enjoyable as VR?
So I think one way to approach this would be to essentially make things not, maybe cut down the amount of interactions just specifically for web and mobile, using that device type check and specifying who can grab those objects. That's one thing. Maybe set it to like a maximum of like 3 or 4 things on a screen. One thing that you could also play around with is, sometimes we have objects where you hold an object and then you need to be holding something in order to interact with something else. I don't know, like putting a key in a door. So like staggering when those interactions turn on. So you can pick up and hold a key, and then the trigger enables for you to interact with the door, rather than having both the key and the door triggers enabled at the same time. So staggering it so that you can kind of lead the player through the flow that they need to accomplish. That can be a better technique, and actually offers a bunch of new ways of thinking about things too.
You also mentioned, for the button icons, I actually love that there are a bunch of options that creators can use that we've already in a way pre-built. But are there ways, can creators use their own images for these buttons if they want?
Not at the moment. That is something that we're looking into, but not at the moment. They're just the button icons that are available. And if you have suggestions for other button icons, then yeah, feel free to share those and feedback, and we'll see what we can do about getting them in as soon as possible.
What's the most important when it comes to, so when the camera is moved away from the player, or like what's the most important? Is it the camera position or the avatar position?
So when we're playing around with detaching the camera from the player will still have control of their avatar. One of the important things to note is that it's very easy to quickly lose which direction your avatar is facing when the camera isn't attached to them facing in the same direction. So it's worth bearing that in mind. That's probably one of the key things, is not necessarily to overuse that, just using it for things like spectate mode or a top-down view, or just manipulating it that way. There's also camera collision, which I didn't really go into, but if you've got a room like full of pillars, or you're in a woods with loads of trees or whatever it is, camera collisions can be really annoying because it bumps the camera up whenever they're just stood in front of a tree. So you'd want to turn off camera collisions if there's those sorts of environments where there's pillars or trees or something where it's going to be a bit of a nuisance to the player. You can also detach the camera, or just make the camera in a different position from the normal player camera. So still looking at the player, but from a different angle. That's probably better to do than having a fixed camera if you're still hoping that players can control their avatar. So there's lots of different ways to manipulate the camera. It's worth experimenting, and there's a really good talk, actually, a GDC talk called 50 Camera Mistakes that's available on YouTube. So go check that out as well. That will help you in terms of thinking about what you might want to do with your camera and might not want to do with the camera too. But yeah, it's a really good opportunity because you can make a top-down thing or a side-scrolling thing or whatever you want to do. I made a side-scrolling jetpack game, which was is pretty straightforward with the camera API. So yeah, have a play.
Can creators anchor their UI to screen size or corners? I mean, how can they go about doing that?
Absolutely, that's how the fix to screen works. So when you've got a piece of UI that you're fixing to the screen, the fix to screen is like a checkbox, and then you actually have the position and rotation of that, and it's in 2D space. So worth bearing that in mind that it will move to depending on a corner, and it's done so like -1 is the left side of the screen, 1 is the right side of the screen on the X axis, -1 is the top, and 1 is the bottom on the Y axis. I might have got that the wrong way around, but I can't remember. But basically, it's values between -1 and 1 on both axes. So yeah, you can fix it to whatever position you want to.
In terms of changing triggers, I mean, to grabbables, do creators necessarily need TypeScript for that? Or is it an easy like toggle that they can just do?
So changing grabbables will automatically work on screens, or everything will just be grabbable. What you might want to do, that I sort of mentioned earlier, was to maybe have not like loads and loads of grabbables all in one small space, because that's quite hard to navigate on screens. And the other thing is you might, if it's like something that you want the player to hold in a certain way, is to set up the avatar pose so that they're holding it correctly.
Oh, someone's talking about, about releasing of their awards. Is it possible for creators to release for mobile alone and not desktop, or vice versa? Is that a possibility?
I don't think it is. I can check and get back to you about that, but I believe it's, if you release it on web and mobile, it will be available on both web and mobile.
What's the plan for templates? Is it already available now?
Yeah, it should be available now. So if you open your PUI in VR, so you will find them in VR, you should be able to find that there's a template called Web and Mobile Examples. Although I saw in the comments, I think one person, maybe Shards, was having difficulty accessing it. So I'll send the engineering team who's involved in that a message and just make sure that everyone should have access to that. And what it means is that you select that template, and then the world that you start with already has all of that stuff in it. It's got the custom input, it's got the selectable triggers, the camera API. You can see all the different ways of using the camera API and the buttons and all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, that should be available to everyone already.
For worlds that creators decide to build for web and mobile, is it possible for them to have users just for web and mobile for a particular world? Let's say I come into a world and only people in that world are players from just web and mobile. Is that possible now?
It's an interesting question. Technically you could have 2 doors, and one only opens when you're in web and mobile, and one only opens when you're in VR. But like, I think my question back would be why? I think that one of the benefits of opening a world for web and mobile players gives like everyone an opportunity to spend more time together and to connect, and for new people to connect with people that are maybe don't have VR headsets. So whilst you could separate people, and in some like scenarios you might want to do that with game design decisions or world design decisions, it's better to I think look for that player concurrency, that we call it concurrency, but essentially where everyone can be together in the same world. It's much more preferable, and it's better for people wanting to come, but getting people to want to come back and to meet up with their friends in that space.
Amazing. And that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you so much, Andy. And
no worries.
Yeah, this was awesome. This was great. And thanks all our creators for joining. I'm sure you must have enjoyed this. And if you have other questions, please put them in chat. I'll work with Andy to compile these questions and then come back with you with answers for the ones we haven't answered. And keep doing the amazing stuff you're doing. We always enjoy seeing all you create. Now you have the tools. We've gone through the deep dive. It's time to build for web and mobile. Looking forward to what you all build. Thank you for today, and do have an amazing rest of the week. Bye for now.